وهذه الجلسة حول السلام
This
والاستقرار
session
في
is
اليمن
going to be on
نحو
peace and
التكامل
stability in
الأمني
Yemen
والفرص
and
الاستراتيجية.
security and their interdependencies and strategic
كثير مننا
opportunities.
يتذكر أن المنتدى
I'm sure that
السابق
many of us
كان
remember in the previous forum or the first forum in Stockholm
كان
in
حديث
June
فيها حول خارطة
2022.
الطريق
We spoke about
حول احتمالية توقيع اتفاق
the previous
سلام
one in
في
The
اليمن.
Hague. We spoke about the roadmap and the possibility of signing a peace agreement in Yemen. And we discussed some of the potential challenges and obstacles that might occur. And these were challenges that many of us spoke about and brought up. And during that forum, we spoke about the issue of inclusivity and ensuring that no one is excluded during the negotiations and the settlement. And this was one of the biggest fears at the time. But it seems like we've now gone back a lot in our discussion on peace in Yemen. The roadmap seems to be a part of our past. I don't know to what extent, but it seems like this thinking has receded to a large extent. The Gaza war has imposed a new perspective or new visions towards Yemen and the conflict in Yemen. And this might help in creating some opportunities, but it might also increase the concerns, the fears, and the challenges. No one knows at this time. And things might need further discussions and questions that are being imposed on us by this very difficult time. When Yemen becomes more interconnected in a broader regional conflict. In the beginning, Yemen was a part of the Saudi-Iranian conflict, or that's how it seemed for many coming from outside Yemen. But now Yemen has become embroiled in a much broader regional conflict, and it is viewed more as a threat to the international community and not just the regional community. I hope that this discussion today in this session is beneficial to all of us. We're going to have the ambassador of the European Union, Gabriel Munwera Binals, and we will also have Mr. Yusuf Al-Balushi, Omani researcher and the head of the Muscat Policy Council, the first independent Omani think tank, and Farea Al-Muslimi, a fellow at Chatham House specializing in Yemen and the Gulf. He is also a founder and former chairperson of the Sana'a Center. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Yusuf. Farea, with regards to what happened over the past year and a half and the Houthi involvement in the Red Sea and in the conflict in supporting the Gaza front and other things, to what extent do you think this has impacted the view of the international community towards Yemen and the conflict in Yemen? If we start with the assumption that after the 7th of October, or the region after the 7th of October is no longer like what it was. And this doesn't apply just to Palestine, it applies to Yemen and many different issues in the region. But the Red Sea attacks, in addition to the fact that it allowed the Houthis two main things, for them to become more brutal at the local level, and also their attempt to use their cross-border attacks. In addition to that, the Houthis has done two things, one that is positive and one that is negative in Yemen. And the thing that is positive, it's a bit bothersome for Yemenis, but what is positive is that the world is now paying attention to the fact that there is a war in Yemen. Yemeni or Western civilians and citizens are paying the price of a conflict in Yemen. IKEA is facing difficulties in shipping. And this has drawn attention to the fact that there is bloodshed ongoing in Yemen. And honestly, this is humiliating for Yemen, as if the war that's been going on for 10 years wasn't sufficient for the world to pay attention to the fact that there was a war. But this is what happened. And the world has paid attention to it, to the level that we have gotten to now. And this is good, I believe, because I think it has also led to the idea that, oh, Yemen's a poor country and something isolated. But no, it's something that could be important and could have an impact. And if we had politicians that were actually mature about it, it could be something that could help them rethinking of Yemen's position and its role in the world. But as if you've seen in the session of the PLC, it's clear that we no longer have people who have any sort of imagination or creativity. But this was something that would have been possible. We could have redefined Yemen And it's also reminded us of something important, that peace in the region is something that is integrated, as if just as the wars are very interrelated, these issues are all very closely related. And so the solution, what's happening in Gaza, even though it is distant, affects Yemen, and vice versa. What's happening in the Red Sea might impact somebody in Norway, for example. And this is important because it might help us rethink these unilateral peace efforts that are dealing with these issues with these countries and crises in a piecemeal approach. And this has always been an unsuccessful method in dealing with peace process. Because these wars are and conflicts are so interrelated, I think this is the positive development, that the world has started to approach Yemen differently from the perspective of peace. And it's also shown that Yemen could have an impact. It's put us on the table. Maybe not in the way that we want to be put on the table, but it's brought Yemen back to the forefront. But the negative development, or the risk here, at least for me personally, is that it could return Yemen to the view that has always been, that the international community has viewed Yemen. And this is a non-Yemeni, or it does not have any Yemeni ownership. It's linked to the daily challenges. The Yemeni file has always, what does it mean to Saudi Arabia? It was always, what does it mean for Saudi Arabia? What does it mean for Al-Qaeda? Or looking at it from the perspective of non-Yemeni actors. And this is one of the risks, I believe. I was just speaking with Yusuf yesterday. We had a session on the Iranian role in Yemen. And the session was overcrowded with diplomats. And it's the Yemen International Forum, not the Iran International Forum. But all of the other sessions were empty. But this is the risk, that people now want to view Yemen through another lens. What is Iran doing? What does Iran mean in Yemen? And this is something that isn't Yemeni. And that's the risk, that we're returning to that, of what would Yemen mean in the axis of resistance? What does Yemen mean to Saudi Arabia? What does Yemen mean to Iran, for example? Another risk is that it has made peace a bargaining chip, that the superpowers and the EU and the UK and the US, they release statements saying that they support the UN Special Envoy, but at the same time they're involved in the conflict in Yemen. And so the peace now becomes a bargaining chip, that if you want to work on peace in Yemen while there's Red Sea attacks, as if this is something that should be banned or prohibited. I think this is the risk that has made the peace in Yemen something that is not desirable at this time, or something that has lost a lot of stock. And I think this is a very dangerous development. What could happen? Or what could happen in the longer term, just so we don't do what we traditionally do in Yemen, of blaming others for our problems. If there is any rearrangement of the priorities at the national level within Yemen, this could help influence the international agenda. Yes, definitely, we're going to have to redefine who are our friends and our allies and who isn't our friend and ally, because the nature of the world has changed and the perspective towards Yemen has changed. But I truly believe this is an opportunity. I don't want to say that the glass is half full, because if it is half full, it's half full of blood. But we need to try to make this into an opportunity, as long as we continue to be creative and have an imagination, as long as the local divisions are not relying on external support as they usually do. Farea, something that you said that I found interesting was that peace, having a piecemeal approach is not correct, where every country, what exactly do you mean? What do you think peace in Yemen should be linked to? To what other context, or to what framework? So you said there shouldn't be a piecemeal approach. We shouldn't look at peace with each country or each conflict separately from the others. What do you mean by that specifically? Not just in Yemen, but the region as a whole. I personally believe that the Iranian nuclear agreement, the 2015 agreement, failed because it did not deal with the other security threats that Iran was posing in the region. It only dealt with an American, European, Iranian agreement, whereas everyone in the region was kept on the outside of it. And this is what led to its failure. And so believing that you can resolve a crisis in Lebanon without believing that you can resolve the crisis in Syria, that's clear that it's no longer feasible. And that's what's happening now. Even when you look at the Western bureaucracies, they're not based on files and strategic priorities. They're divided based on the countries, on the country desks. And the bureaucrats at these desks don't speak to each other, even though they're within the same departments or sections. And this separation has led to strategies that are not sustainable, that are not long term. And the second dimension is that people believe that if there are security arrangements, this might be sufficient. But it's very clear that the economic arrangements and having a much broader perspective is needed. Security arrangements on their own are not sufficient. It was believed that Yemen is a very isolated and faraway country, and so it would not lead to migrants, for example. And so it is safe for the West. The West has not paid the price for the conflict in Yemen, but the Red Sea attacks have ended this fantasy that the conflict in Yemen could cause a daily disturbance for anyone in the world, even more than Syria, possibly. And so this perspective and this piecemeal approach to peace efforts, I think, is less troublesome than it was. Could it be reflected? Could it become a more strategic and comprehensive view? I pray to God that that's the case, but that's going to need time for us to actually see that shift.
Thank you, Mr. Farea. On the Yemeni parties, you spoke about the international community and how perhaps it transitioned or how there were changes in the way it views Yemen. But were there changes in the Yemeni dynamics, in how the Yemenis view or how their priorities, or how they approach this conflict? Was there a change in terms of the Houthis? Do they consider themselves now more regional of a party rather than local? For example, was there a change on the part of the government that they now think more seriously about unifying their efforts, perhaps? Or perhaps the other way around, things are moving towards greater escalation, greater tension?
On one hand, I think it has increased the fantasies on both sides. It has increased the Houthi fantasy that they believe that Yemenis will change their opinions of the Houthis, even if they don't change their behavior, as long as they're fighting with Palestine. And this is a lie that they're telling themselves, because Yemenis know who they are. And it has also increased the fantasy of the international recognized government in two ways. That first, they believe the world will fight on its behalf, or that they'll give them the means to fight without them changing anything. And so what has happened is that this has increased the fantasies on both sides, but in different ways. What also has changed, and specifically with regards to the Houthis, and specifically with regards to the regional shifts, is there has been another change here. Not another change, but for other reasons. Meaning that the Houthis today, they're at the forefront of the axis of resistance. They're in the front seat. Not because they're on the Red Sea, but because Hassan Nasrallah died and Syria is gone. And so they've changed some of the arrangement. This has changed the arrangements. And secondly, also from a certain perspective, it's not for Yemen. It's not the internal Yemeni reasons that have changed this impression. And the other issue is that the behavior, or at least the narrative used by the internationally recognized government on peace has changed, because they've now paid attention to the fact that Saudi Arabia has three priorities, which is 2030, Vision 2030, and Vision 2030. Their priority is no longer fighting with anyone, or being involved in a conflict, or fighting on behalf of anyone, or flexing their power. So these changes have affected the situation in Yemen, but they did not start in Yemen. They were not caused in Yemen. And going back to the idea of something also that has shifted, the supporters of peace in Yemen were very few, and most of them, I think, are people that attend meetings like this one, this forum. And now they've gotten even fewer, and this is one of the real challenges that I see today. That this is one of the risks that we might face in the long term, that most people might, and I'm talking here at the social level, most people might not even be able to envision a future with peace, and might not even envision any real interests and opportunities and development outside of war and the war economy. And so I think there's another shift. So you're saying supporters of peace are very few. Is it that they're very few, or do Yemenis view that the environment is still not conducive to a settlement, that there's still an imbalance of power? And so any political settlement that is reached will be in the interest of one side or the other. This is definitely the case, that there is an imbalance of power, and there's also an imbalance of responsibilities and authorities and power, and this is an important factor. But I'm talking about states, even at the international level. Either these countries have stopped their involvement, or that they're now actively involved in the fighting. Today, for example, a country like Sweden, there is a country that first hosted Yemenis in important talks, but now they've stopped even their humanitarian assistance to Yemen. And this isn't, the situation has changed completely. Some of the countries that were the biggest donors, like Germany, today it's completely shifted. Their role is a negative role, just like a country like France, for example. And so this is completely shifted. Everyone in the world now has less of a desire to see peace in Yemen at many different levels. And because peace in Yemen is no longer a direct issue for the Gulf, the need for reaching a peace agreement between the Yemenis and it being supported by the regional actors is no longer desired. As long as the region is safe, there's no longer threat. And so the stock of peace is now imbalanced. And this isn't just, if you look at before the 7th of October, some people had already started imagining or talking about where the negotiations will be so they can book their tickets and prepare themselves, where the agreement will be signed. This, because that's how close things were. There was some very positive thinking and engagement, and there were details, unlike the situation that we are in today. And so that's why I say that those supporting peace are fewer. Those involved directly in the problems are more, and those who want peace are much weaker often.
I just wanted to confirm what Abdullah was said. I deserve 2 zeros on the left in diplomacy, and to respond to Mr. Abdul Wahab, because he's my representative in parliament in my region, and I disagree with him clearly. I don't believe at all that any roadmap can be worse than war. This is difficult. As a Yemeni, you cannot persuade me that peace is worse than a single day of war. You can talk about a roadmap, criticize it, and say it's not clear, it's not transparent, it's not comprehensive, it's not full, but this is not the idea. This is my first part, and I cannot accept it, and I don't think anybody in Yemen can accept this. Based on this, we can anticipate we need to change our expectations of mediations, who are the mediations, and who we want to mediate. What the colleague said, that Oman is a facilitator, not a mediator. Oman, Qatar, no other country in the world should be a mediator in a civil war, and they cannot, and they will not succeed. Countries can maybe mediate between countries. They may assist, they may do something, but the state cannot be a mediator in a civil war. And that is why anybody can say whatever they want on the peace process in Yemen. And ultimately, it is the only path that we need to look for. A path of peace led by the UN, not led by any other country or any other region. Why is this important? Because the worst that can happen to Yemen, in my viewpoint, is like the Astana pathway, like Kharij, a pathway that cannot be controlled, cannot be overseen. There are closed doors where countries make decisions that we don't know about and have nothing to do with us. We've seen this in Syria, we've seen this in other countries, and we've seen it at various levels. Now, but what should we do? And when I say we cannot expect peace from Oman or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, this does not mean that we should not ensure that these countries are at least with us in the peace wagon, because we are a poor country, we're surrounded by rich countries. So first, if they don't believe in peace, then they will all practice proxy solutions to end this peace. And second of all, as we all know, if tomorrow or the day after or a year later there is peace in Yemen, and before all of this, they will say what we need to look for is that these countries are with us in the peace wagon at the very least. Even if they're not mediating, they need to be supportive and an agreement of peace, although they don't lead it. And why do I say this is important? Because one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, that made the Gulf Initiative fail in 2011 is that it was not Gulf, except by name. Gulf Initiative, except by name. The Gulf Initiative was an honorary name. The Gulf was not involved in Yemen, by the way, and therefore it did not have shares in the transitional process in Yemen at all. It was called the Gulf Initiative, and this was an honorary name. It was an initiative led by the world, and the Gulf had nothing to do with it. And this is first. And that is why it failed, because the Gulf countries were not involved in it. And the second thing is that these countries should be with us in peace, because we know that ultimately, when we get to a peace in Yemen, the West will not rebuild Yemen or reconstruct it, nor will the EU. It will be the Gulf countries. We can't lie to each other. Ultimately, the West now has stopped humanitarian aid to a country that it knows is facing the worst humanitarian crisis around the world. And it's difficult for them to make these commitments to building a school or a train 20 years from now. What we need to do is not to confront the roadmap, but rather, if you would notice, from 2015 until 2020, the West was urging the Gulf or calling the Gulf for peace in Yemen, was inviting them to stop the war in Yemen. In 2021 or 2022, the Gulf now is calling the international community to stop the war in Yemen. Now we want to bring the West to the square where the Gulf was, because now the Gulf wants peace and the West doesn't want sleep. And 8 years ago, the Gulf didn't want the peace and the West wanted the peace. So in my opinion, how do we bring all these together and create a sound equation in Yemen? What we need to do is that, with the caveat that I can't stop mentioning every once in a while, it shouldn't be a peace process built by any other country in a civil war in any place in the world.
I agree in principle with Yusuf, albeit partially, that the problem at its core is in our hands as Yemenis. But I think this also is an attempt to make the neighbors seem more innocent than they are. Yes, the problem started here, but you have the richest Arab countries surrounding the poorest Arab country, bombing it for a decade almost to try to change it politically through proxy wars as well. Yes, the problem started within our borders, but it quickly expanded. And not just Oman, I'm saying the Gulf in general and external actors. I think they're not as innocent as you might have presented them. But this doesn't mean our objective as Yemenis needs to be to focus on this dimension. And we must not, every time we fail, to blame the outside or external actors for that. I agree with that. But in parentheses, it's important for us to also understand and recognize the role. With regards to could these changes actually make a difference, these developments on the ground, I think the question answers itself. If all of these developments don't actually lead to a unified command and control and for them to become less fragmented, then I don't know what will. After what happened in Syria, many Yemenis imagined or envisioned or expected a scenario of Ahmed al-Shara, but in Yemen. And this is something that's very possible. But on the other side, maybe the government might wake up tomorrow with the Houthis in Aden. The Yemeni armed forces is like Bashar al-Assad's army with regards to their payment of salaries and their nutrition and all of that. And so watch what you wish for. We need to be careful what we wish for, because it might come on the other side. And on that specifically, and this is my concluding remark, I wanted to expand what Khaldun was saying, or his wish for diplomatic missions to return to Aden, to the interim capital. But I wanted to expand that to include the Yemeni government itself. I wish that they return to Aden as well, them and their families as well. We can't call the international community to come to Aden when the government and the presidency and all of our officials and politicians and political parties are not Aden. You can't tell someone to go spend the night at your house when you're not there to open it for them. And that's our problem on our side as Yemenis. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience.